The satellite phone crackled to life at 0300 hours in our forward operating base outside Kandahar. I figured it was routine until I heard my father's voice on the other end, casual as if he was calling about weekend fishing plans. Frank had never called me overseas before. My stomach dropped even before he started talking. "Wyatt, I need to tell you something," he said, and I could hear the familiar sound of a beer can opening in the background. "I used your college fund to pay off my loans. You didn't need it anyway since you're already in the military." $28,000. Gone. The money my mother had saved working double shifts as a nurse before cancer took her when I was 16. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I calmly replied, "Good luck with that, Dad," before hanging up. My mind was already racing. I sat in the darkness of the communications tent, staring at the silent phone in my hands. The weight of what Frank had just told me pressed down like a physical force. My mother, Sarah, had died of cancer when I was 16 years old. She'd been a registered nurse at Mercy General Hospital, working 12-hour shifts and sometimes picking up extra hours in the emergency room. What Frank didn't know I'd discovered was that she'd also been working a second job cleaning office buildings at night, all to save money for my education. I remembered finding her asleep at the kitchen table one morning when I was 15, still in her scrubs from the hospital, with cleaning supplies scattered around her feet. She'd worked until 4 in the morning and had to be back at the hospital by 6. When I asked her why she was pushing herself so hard, she just smiled that tired smile and said, "Education is the one thing nobody can ever take away from you, honey. This money is your future." Frank had promised me at her funeral that he would protect that fund. He'd stood there in his black suit, tears streaming down his face, swearing on her grave that he would make sure her sacrifice meant something. He was a construction foreman then, making decent money, and I believed him completely. Frank had his flaws, mainly his love of poker games at the American Legion and his tendency to bet on football games. But I never imagined he would touch Mom's money. I joined the Army at 18, not because I had to, but because I wanted to serve my country and gain some discipline. The plan was always to use Mom's college fund when I got out to study engineering. Frank supported that decision, even seemed proud when I shipped out to basic training. He'd driven me to the airport and shaken my hand like a man, telling me he was proud to have a son willing to serve. But now, sitting in this tent 8,000 miles from home, I realized how naive I'd been. During our phone conversation, Frank had admitted something that made my blood run cold. He hadn't just taken the money recently. He'd been accessing the account for over 2 years, skimming small amounts for his gambling habits. 500 here for a poker game, 1,000 there for sports bets that didn't pan out. The worst part was how casual he'd been about it. "You didn't need it anyway," he'd said, as if my mother's sacrifice meant nothing, as if working herself into exhaustion, possibly weakening her immune system before the cancer hit, was just some inconvenience he could dismiss. The final 28,000 had gone to pay off loan sharks who'd been threatening him. He owed money to some serious people, and instead of coming to me for help, instead of admitting he had a problem, he'd stolen from his dead wife's memory. But what really twisted the knife was the forgery. Frank had admitted during our call that he'd forged my signature on bank documents to access the account. He'd practiced my signature until he could replicate it perfectly, then walked into the bank like he had every right to that money. The teller, who knew our family, never questioned it. Why would she? Frank was my father, and everyone in town knew about Mom's college fund for me. Frank showed absolutely no remorse during our conversation. If anything, he seemed annoyed that I wasn't being more understanding. "I raised you alone for 8 years, he'd said. "You owe me something for that." The entitlement in his voice made me want to punch something. This was the man my mother had loved, the man she'd trusted to care for me and honor her wishes. Instead, he'd betrayed everything she'd stood for. As I sat there in the Afghan night, listening to the distant sound of generators and the occasional radio chatter, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The hurt was there, deep and raw, but underneath it was something colder, something calculating. Frank thought he'd gotten away with something. He thought his military son would just accept this betrayal and move on. He had no idea what was coming for him. What Frank didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, was that his timing couldn't have been worse. 6 months earlier, while deployed in Afghanistan, I'd received a letter that changed everything. It came from a law firm in Bismarck, North Dakota, addressed to me in careful legal handwriting. The lawyer, Margaret Phillips, had been trying to locate me for months regarding an inheritance I never knew existed. My maternal grandfather, Robert Sullivan, had owned a 40-acre plot of land in western North Dakota. Grandpa Robert had died when I was 12, and I remembered him as a quiet man who worked for the railroad and kept to himself. What I didn't know was that he'd left that land to me in a will that had been contested by distant relatives for over a decade. The legal battles had finally been resolved, and the land was rightfully mine. But here's where the story gets interesting. In the past 5 years, oil had been discovered throughout that region of North Dakota. The Bakken Formation had turned worthless prairie into some of the most valuable real estate in America. My grandfather's 40 acres sat right in the middle of it, complete with mineral rights that he'd been smart enough to retain when the railroad was buying up land decades earlier. Margaret Phillips had been very clear in her letter. The land was worth approximately $200,000, possibly more depending on how the oil exploration developed. There were already 3 companies interested in leasing the mineral rights, which would provide steady income for years to come. All I needed to do was return to the United States, prove my identity as Robert Sullivan's grandson, and sign the paperwork to claim the inheritance. I'd been planning this as a surprise for Frank. My idea was to come home from deployment, claim the inheritance, and use part of it to pay off his gambling debts. I knew about his problems. Everyone in our small town knew. But I figured family helps family. I was going to clear his slate and maybe help him get his construction business back on solid ground. The college fund would stay untouched for my education, and we'd both benefit from Grandpa Robert's unexpected gift. The inheritance process required both my signature as the beneficiary and Frank's consent as my closest living relative. Since the original will had been contested, it was a legal formality, but a necessary one. I'd already signed preliminary paperwork, but the final claim needed to be processed in person with both of us present. I'd been planning to surprise him with this when I came home on leave in 2 months. Now, sitting in that tent with the satellite phone still warm in my hands, I realized how perfectly Frank had destroyed everything. His betrayal hadn't just cost us $28,000. It had cost him $200,000, because there was no way I was sharing this inheritance with a man who'd stolen from my mother's memory. Frank had chosen gambling debts over family loyalty, immediate gratification over long-term trust. He'd forged my signature and violated the one promise he'd made at Mom's funeral. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Frank had betrayed me for $28,000, not knowing that 10 times that amount was sitting there waiting for him to simply be a decent father and honor his wife's memory. Instead, he'd chosen to steal from the fund my mother had literally worked herself to death to build. As I sat there processing this information, I felt a cold calm settling over me. Frank thought he'd gotten away with something clever. He thought his son would just accept this betrayal and move on with military life. He had no idea that his greed had cost him the biggest windfall of his life. And more importantly, he had no idea what I was going to do about it. The plan forming in my mind wasn't about revenge, exactly. It was about justice, about making sure my mother's sacrifice was honored and protected, about ensuring that Frank faced real consequences for his choices. He wanted to gamble with family money? Fine. But he was about to learn that some bets have consequences he never saw coming. The next morning, I reached out to Jake Morrison, my Army buddy who'd been stationed with me in Germany before we both deployed. Jake worked in financial crimes investigation for the military police, and he had skills that would prove invaluable. When I explained what Frank had done, Jake was immediately on board to help me understand the full scope of my father's financial problems. "Give me 72 hours, Jake said, over our encrypted communication channel. I'll get you a complete picture of what we're dealing with." Jake was true to his word. When his report came back, it painted a picture of financial disaster that was even worse than I'd imagined. Frank owed $67,000 total, spread across multiple creditors. He had maxed out 4 different credit cards, taken out 2 personal loans from different banks, and owed $15,000 to Tony the Fish Romano, a local bookie, who operated out of the back room of Carlucci's Pizza in downtown. His construction business, Sullivan & Sons Contracting, was 3 months behind on equipment payments, and had lost 2 major contracts in the past year due to Frank's unreliability. Clients had complained about him missing deadlines and showing up to job sites smelling like alcohol. His work truck had been repossessed 6 weeks ago, and he was driving a beat-up Ford pickup that belonged to his business partner. But the information that made my blood boil was what Jake discovered about Frank's public narrative. My father had been telling everyone in town that I had given him the college money to help save the family business. He'd been portraying himself as the proud father of a military son who'd chosen to sacrifice his education to support his family. Frank was walking around town like some kind of hero, accepting sympathy and praise for raising such a selfless son. Jake found evidence of this lie in loan applications Frank had submitted to 3 different banks. On each application, he'd listed family support from military son as additional income, claiming I was sending him money from my army pay to help with business expenses. He'd used this false information to secure additional credit, essentially doubling down on his lies to dig himself even deeper into debt. The most sickening part was how the community had responded. Jake found social media posts from friends and neighbors praising Frank for raising such a devoted son. Mrs. Henderson from the church had written on Facebook about what a blessing it was to see young people who understood family responsibility. The local newspaper had even mentioned it in their community pride section, talking about local military families supporting each other. Frank had turned my mother's sacrifice into a public relations campaign for himself. He'd taken something sacred and twisted it into a lie that made him look good while setting me up to look ungrateful if I ever contradicted his story. If I came home and revealed the truth, it would look like I was attacking a struggling father who'd raised me alone. Frank had been clever enough to create a narrative that protected him from consequences. Jake also discovered that Frank's gambling problem was worse than anyone knew. Tony Romano's operation was just the tip of the iceberg. Frank had been placing bets through online gambling sites, participating in illegal poker games in the back rooms of local bars, and even traveling to the casino on the Indian reservation 2 hours away every weekend. His losses over the past 2 years totaled nearly $40,000, not counting the interest and penalties from his other debts. The picture Jake painted was of a man in complete financial freefall who'd been lying and manipulating everyone around him to maintain his lifestyle. Frank hadn't just stolen from me. He'd been lying to banks, friends, and neighbors to cover his tracks. He'd built an entire false reality to protect himself from facing consequences. But Jake's investigation also revealed something else. Frank was getting desperate. Tony Romano had been asking questions around town about collecting what he was owed. Frank's business partner was considering dissolving their partnership because of the financial liability. The house I'd grown up in, the house my mother had loved, was 2 months behind on mortgage payments and facing foreclosure. Frank was a drowning man, and instead of asking for help, he'd chosen to steal from the one source of money that wasn't his to touch. He'd violated the one promise that should have been sacred, and then lied about it to make himself look good. The betrayal went deeper than money. It went to the core of who Frank was as a person. As I read through Jake's report, I felt that cold calm settling even deeper. Frank thought he'd been clever, but he'd actually created the perfect conditions for his own downfall. He'd built his house of lies on a foundation of sand, and I was about to become the tide that washed it all away. The inheritance would give me the resources I needed, and Frank's own lies would give me the weapon to use against him. Frank had gambled with my mother's memory and lost. Now he was about to find out what it really meant to face consequences for his choices. The game was just beginning, and he didn't even know he was playing. 3 weeks later, I boarded a military transport back to the United States for emergency leave. I'd told my commanding officer that I needed to handle urgent family business, which wasn't exactly a lie. The 15-hour flight gave me plenty of time to refine my plan and prepare for what was coming. My first stop wasn't home. Instead, I drove straight from the airport to Woodlawn Cemetery, where my mother was buried. Her headstone was simple granite with her name, dates, and the inscription she'd requested, "She gave everything for those she loved." Standing there in my desert camouflage uniform, I told her everything. About Frank's betrayal, about the inheritance, about what I was planning to do. "I'm going to make this right, Mom," I whispered to her gravestone. "He's not going to get away with dishonoring your sacrifice." The next morning, I met with Margaret Phillips at her law office in Bismarck. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in estate law and mineral rights. The inheritance paperwork was complex, but straightforward. As Robert Sullivan's grandson and only living descendant, I had a clear legal right to the property. The oil companies were already lined up to lease the mineral rights, and the first payment would be $50,000, with monthly royalties projected at around $8,000. The land has appreciated significantly, Margaret explained as we went through the documents. Your grandfather was smart to retain the mineral rights when he bought this property in 1962. He probably never imagined what it would be worth someday. I signed all the preliminary paperwork and arranged for the final processing. The inheritance would be official within 30 days, and the first oil royalty payment would arrive 6 weeks after that. Margaret was curious about why I was processing this alone when her files indicated I had a father who should also be involved, but I simply told her it was complicated family business. From Bismarck, I drove to Mercy General Hospital, where my mother had worked. I wanted to talk to people who'd known her, to better understand the sacrifice she'd made for my education. What I learned there broke my heart and strengthened my resolve at the same time. Betty Martinez, the nursing supervisor who'd worked with my mother for 8 years, invited me into her office when she heard I was visiting. Betty was a woman in her 60s who'd seen generations of nurses come and go, but she remembered my mother clearly. Sarah was special, Betty told me, her eyes growing misty. She worked harder than anyone I've ever supervised. The day shift, then she'd go home, make you dinner, help with your homework, and then head out to clean those office buildings until 4 in the morning. She'd be back here by 6 a.m. for another 12-hour shift. Betty opened a file cabinet and pulled out an old employee folder. I probably shouldn't show you this, but I think you need to know how much your education meant to her. Inside were copies of deposit slips from the bank, showing my mother's methodical savings plan. Every 2 weeks, she deposited exactly $400 into my college fund, money she'd earned from her cleaning job. She never complained, Betty continued. But we all worried about her. Working 18-hour days isn't sustainable for anyone, but especially not for a single mother. We tried to get her to slow down, but she'd just smile and say she was building her son's future. Betty then told me something that hit me like a physical blow. The doctors think her exhaustion contributed to her immune system being compromised when the cancer hit. She was so run down from overwork that her body couldn't fight like it should have. We'll never know for sure, but she let the sentence hang in the air. My mother had literally worked herself to death to save money for my education, and Frank had stolen it to feed his gambling addiction. The magnitude of his betrayal was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't just about money. It was about my mother's life, her sacrifice, her dreams for my future. I spent the rest of the day talking to other nurses, doctors, and staff members who'd known my mother. Everyone had the same story. Sarah Sullivan was the hardest working person they'd ever known, devoted entirely to giving her son opportunities she'd never had. Several people mentioned how proud she'd been when I was accepted to the engineering program at the state university, how she'd talked constantly about my future career. That evening I drove through our old neighborhood, looking at the house where I'd grown up. It was smaller than I remembered, with peeling paint and an overgrown yard that spoke to Frank's recent neglect. I didn't stop or knock on the door. Frank didn't even know I was in the country, and I wanted to keep it that way for now. Instead, I checked into a motel on the other side of town and started making phone calls. My first call was to Pastor Williams at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, where our family had attended when I was younger. I explained that I wanted to organize a family dinner to honor my mother's memory and thank Frank publicly for his support during my military service. Pastor Williams was enthusiastic about the idea and offered the church's community center for the event. "Your father has been through so much," Pastor Williams said. "It will be wonderful to celebrate the positive impact your military service has had on the family. He's been telling everyone how proud he is that you chose to support the family business instead of pursuing college right away." Even the pastor had bought into Frank's lie. My father had been so thorough in his deception that he'd convinced our entire community that he was the victim of circumstance rather than the architect of his own problems. But that just made what I was planning even more perfect. Over the next 2 days, I made calls to relatives, family, friends, and neighbors, inviting them to what I described as a celebration dinner. I told everyone that I wanted to publicly thank Frank for his sacrifices and support, and that I had some special announcements to make about our family's future. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People were excited to hear from me, and eager to attend what they thought would be a heartwarming family celebration. The final piece of my plan fell into place when I made a call to Tony Romano. I'd gotten his number from Jake's investigation, and I arranged to meet him at his pizza place. Tony was a stocky man in his 50s, who looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a small-town bookie. We sat in the back booth, and I told him I was Frank's son, home on military leave. "Your old man owes me 15 grand, Tony said without preamble, plus interest. I've been patient because he's got a kid in the service, but patience don't pay my bills." I told Tony I was planning a family dinner to address Frank's debts, and I invited him to attend. "I think everyone involved should hear what I have to say," I explained. Tony was intrigued enough to agree, especially when I suggested that his presence might help resolve the debt situation. Everything was in place. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday night at the church community center. Frank thought he was being honored for his sacrifices. The community thought they were celebrating a heartwarming military family story. Tony Romano thought he might finally collect his money, and I knew I was about to reveal the truth that would change everything. Frank had built his house of lies carefully, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd built it on a foundation that belonged to me, and I was about to pull that foundation out from under him. Saturday evening arrived with perfect autumn weather, the kind of crisp October night that made small-town gatherings feel special. I arrived at St. Matthew's Community Center early, wearing my dress blue Army uniform and carrying a folder of documents that would change everything. Frank was already there, greeting people at the door like he was running for mayor. The sight of my father playing the role of proud patriarch made my stomach turn. He was wearing his best suit, the same one he'd worn to my mother's funeral, and he had that politician's smile he used when he wanted something from someone. Frank shook hands and accepted condolences about his struggles with the easy grace of a man who'd been practicing his victim routine for months. "There's my boy," Frank announced when he saw me, spreading his arms wide for a public embrace. "My son, the hero." The assembled crowd, about 30 people from our church and community, applauded as Frank pulled me into a hug that felt like a performance. I played my part, smiling and accepting congratulations on my military service, while my mind stayed focused on what was coming. Pastor William said grace over the potluck dinner that the church ladies had prepared, and we all settled in for what everyone expected to be a heartwarming celebration. Frank had positioned himself at the head table, with me beside him, and an empty chair where my mother should have been. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. During dinner, I listened to Frank hold court with stories about raising me alone after my mother's death, about the sacrifices he'd made to support my military career, about how proud he was that I'd chosen family responsibility over personal ambition. Every word was a lie wrapped in enough truth to sound believable. Frank had always been a good storyteller, but tonight he was performing the role of his life. Wyatt could have gone to college on that money his mother saved, Frank told the table with practiced sincerity, but he chose to help his old man keep the family business going instead. That's the kind of character the Army builds in our young people. Mrs. Henderson, the church organist who'd known our family for 20 years, dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. "Sarah would be so proud," she whispered. "Such a selfless young man." I nodded and smiled, playing the part of the humble soldier while my anger burned cold and steady. Frank was using my mother's memory as a prop in his performance, turning her sacrifice into a lie that made him look good. Every person in that room believed they were celebrating something beautiful, when they were actually watching a master manipulator work his craft. About halfway through dinner, I noticed Tony Romano slip in through the side door. He dressed up for the occasion in a rumpled suit that had seen better days, and he took a seat in the back where Frank couldn't see him immediately. I caught Tony's eye and nodded slightly. He understood that his moment was coming. After dinner, Pastor Williams called for attention and introduced me to make my remarks. The room fell quiet as I stood up, still in my dress blues, holding the folder of documents that would change everything. Frank sat beside me with that proud father smile, completely unaware that he was about to be destroyed. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, my voice steady and clear. When I called to organize this dinner, I told you I wanted to publicly thank my father for his support and make some announcements about our family's future. I meant every word of that. Frank's smile grew wider, and he reached over to squeeze my shoulder in a gesture that probably looked affectionate to everyone watching. But before I do that, I continued, I think everyone deserves to know the truth about what's been happening in our family. Frank's smile faltered slightly, but he still hadn't caught on to what was coming. I opened my folder and pulled out the first document, bank records showing every transaction from my college fund over the past 2 years. 3 weeks ago, while I was deployed overseas, my father called me with some news. He told me he'd used my college fund, the money my mother saved working 2 jobs before she died, to pay off his gambling debts. The room went dead silent. Frank's face went pale, but he tried to maintain his composure. Now, son, he started to say, but I held up my hand. I have bank records showing that my father has been systematically draining my college fund for over 2 years, I continued, holding up the documents. $28,000 that my mother saved working double shifts as a nurse and cleaning office buildings until 4 in the morning. Money she literally worked herself to death to provide. I could see the shock spreading across the faces in the crowd. Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open. Pastor Williams looked like he'd been slapped. Frank started to stand up, but I placed a firm hand on his shoulder and pushed him back down. I also have recordings of our phone conversation where my father admitted to forging my signature on bank documents to access this account, I said, pulling out my phone. This is legal in our state with one-party consent. Would you like to hear it? Frank's composure finally cracked. You don't understand, he said desperately, looking around the room at faces that had turned from sympathetic to horrified. I was in trouble. I had no choice. That's when Tony Romano stood up in the back of the room. Frank, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. You still owe me 15 grand, plus interest. When exactly were you planning to pay that? The revelation that Frank owed money to a known bookie sent another wave of shock through the room. People began whispering to each other, putting together pieces of a puzzle they'd never realized existed. Frank's gambling problem wasn't news to everyone, but the extent of his deception was becoming clear. This man, I said, gesturing toward Tony, is one of several creditors my father owes money to. Instead of asking for help, instead of admitting he had a gambling problem, he chose to steal from his dead wife's memory to pay his debts. Frank tried one last desperate gamble. I raised you alone, he said, his voice getting louder and more defensive. After your mother died, I did everything for you. You owe me something for that. The words hung in the air like poison. Even the people who might have been sympathetic to Frank's situation were appalled by his sense of entitlement. Using his wife's death as justification for stealing from their son was a bridge too far for anyone to cross. I looked around the room at faces filled with disappointment, anger, and disgust. These were people who'd known our family for years, who'd respected my mother's memory, who'd been manipulated by Frank's lies. They deserved to know what kind of man they'd been supporting. But here's what my father doesn't know, I said, pulling out the final set of documents. Here's what makes this betrayal so perfectly ironic. Frank looked at me with confused desperation, still not understanding what was coming. While I was deployed, I inherited my grandfather's property in North Dakota, 40 acres with mineral rights in the middle of the Bakken oil formation. It's worth approximately $200,000. The room gasped collectively. Frank's face went through a series of expressions, from confusion to understanding to absolute horror as the magnitude of what he'd done hit him. I was planning to surprise my father with this inheritance, I continued. I was going to pay off his debts, help him save his business, and honor my mother's memory by using her college fund for its intended purpose. All he had to do was be a decent father and keep his promise to protect what she'd sacrificed for. Frank stared at me like I'd just told him the world was ending. In a way, I had. He'd destroyed his relationship with his only son and thrown away $200,000 for the sake of $28,000 in gambling debts. The trap was sprung, and Frank was caught completely. His lies were exposed, his reputation was destroyed, and he was finally facing the consequences of his choices. But I wasn't finished yet. The real justice was still to come. Frank sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and growing horror as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. The room remained dead silent, except for the sound of whispered conversations as people processed what they'd just learned. I could see the mental calculations happening in real time as friends and neighbors realized how thoroughly they'd been deceived. "That's not. You can't," Frank stammered, reaching for the inheritance documents. I pulled them back before he could touch them. "The inheritance is mine alone," I said clearly, making sure everyone in the room could hear. "It required your cooperation as my next of kin, but that was when I thought you were an honorable man who kept his promises. That cooperation is no longer available." Frank's business partner, Jim Mueller, stood up from his table near the front. Jim was a decent man who'd been carrying Frank's dead weight for months, and his face was red with anger. "You mean to tell me," Jim said, his voice shaking, "that while I've been covering for your mistakes and making excuses to clients, you've been stealing money and lying about it?" "Jim, please," Frank started, but Jim cut him off. "We're done, Frank. Our partnership is dissolved effective immediately. I'm not having my reputation destroyed by association with this." Jim gathered his wife and walked out without another word. Frank watched 20 years of business relationship disappear in 30 seconds. Tony Romano stood up and walked to the front of the room with the casual confidence of a man who'd been in situations like this before. "Well, Frank," he said conversationally, "this explains why you've been so confident about paying me back. Too bad for you, the kid's got more sense than his old man." The presence of a known bookie at a church dinner was surreal, but Tony's matter-of-fact approach to collecting debts made everything feel more real. Frank owed money to dangerous people, and everyone in the room now understood how desperate his situation had become. "I still need my 15 grand, Tony continued, "plus interest. And since it looks like your inheritance fairy tale just went up in smoke, we need to discuss alternative payment arrangements." Frank looked around the room desperately, seeking allies or sympathy, but found only disgusted faces and disappointed shakes of the head. These were people who'd known him for decades, who'd watched him raise me after my mother died, who'd believed his stories about family loyalty and sacrifice. Now they saw him for what he really was. Pastor Williams stood up with the kind of righteous anger that only comes from being used by someone you trusted. "Frank," he said, his voice carrying the authority of moral judgment, "I've known you for 15 years. I performed Sarah's funeral service. I watched you promise at her graveside that you'd honor her memory and care for your son. This is not just theft. It's a desecration of everything she stood for." The religious condemnation hit Frank harder than anything else. He'd been counting on the church community's forgiveness and support, but Pastor Williams had just made it clear that some betrayals couldn't be absolved with simple repentance. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been crying quietly since my revelations began, stood up with shaking hands. "I worked with your wife at the hospital charity drive," she said, her voice breaking. "Sarah used to tell us about working those cleaning jobs to save for Wyatt's education. She was so proud, so hopeful about his future. How could you steal from that?" Frank tried one more desperate deflection. "You don't understand what it's been like," he said, his voice getting higher and more frantic. "Raising a kid alone, trying to keep a business going, dealing with all the pressure. I made mistakes, but I was trying to survive. That's when I played my ace." I pulled out my phone and queued up the recording of our conversation. Frank's voice filled the room, casual and unrepentant. "I used your college fund to pay off my loans. You didn't need it anyway since you're already in the military." Then came the part where he admitted to forging my signature and taking money for gambling over 2 years. The recording was devastating because it captured Frank's complete lack of remorse. This wasn't a man who'd made a desperate mistake. This was someone who felt entitled to steal from his son and lie about it to the community. His own words condemned him more thoroughly than anything I could say. When the recording ended, I stood up and addressed the room one final time. "I want everyone to understand what I'm going to do with the inheritance that my father threw away," I said. $28,000, the exact amount he stole, is going to the Mercy General Hospital Cancer Wing as a memorial fund in my mother's name. The Sarah Sullivan Memorial Fund will help other families dealing with cancer, honoring the sacrifice she made instead of feeding gambling addiction. The announcement drew the first positive response of the evening, with several people nodding approval and even some scattered applause. Frank watched his reputation crumble as I turned his theft into something that would honor my mother's memory. As for the criminal charges, I continued, pulling out another set of documents, I've already filed a complaint with the police for theft and forgery. The bank has confirmed that my signature was forged on multiple documents. My father will face the legal consequences of his choices. Frank's face went completely white. He'd been counting on family loyalty to protect him from legal consequences, but I'd just made it clear that blood relation didn't excuse criminal behavior. You can't do this to me, Frank whispered, finally understanding that his world was collapsing. I'm your father. You stopped being my father when you stole from my mother's memory, I replied. A real father would have asked for help. A real father would have honored his wife's sacrifice. A real father wouldn't forge his son's signature and lie to an entire community about it. Tony Romano interrupted the family drama with practical concerns. This has been real educational, he said, but I still got a business to run. Frank, you got 48 hours to come up with a payment plan, or we discuss this differently. The threat was clear enough that several people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Frank's gambling debts weren't just going to disappear because his son had cut him off, and everyone understood that Tony's patience had limits. As people began filing out of the community center, they stopped to shake my hand and express their disgust with Frank's behavior. The same people who'd been praising him an hour earlier now couldn't get away from him fast enough. Frank sat alone at the head table, surrounded by empty chairs and abandoned plates, finally understanding the true cost of his betrayal. The justice wasn't just financial, it was social and moral. Frank had built his life on lies and manipulation, and now everyone could see who he really was. He'd lost his son, his business partner, his community standing, and his reputation in a single evening. Most importantly, he'd lost any claim to my mother's legacy or my loyalty. But even as I watched him sit there in the wreckage of his own making, I knew this was only the beginning. Real justice would take time to fully unfold. 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse as Judge Patricia Sullivan, no relation but sharing my mother's maiden name, read Frank's sentence. He'd pled guilty to theft and forgery charges in exchange for 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, and mandatory gambling addiction counseling. The criminal conviction meant he could never work in construction again, effectively ending the career he'd spent 30 years building. Frank had aged visibly during the legal proceedings. His hair had gone completely gray, and he'd lost weight that he couldn't afford to lose. The house I'd grown up in had been foreclosed, and he was living in a studio apartment above the hardware store downtown. His truck was gone, repossessed along with most of his tools and equipment. The man who'd once run a successful business was now working part-time stocking shelves at the grocery store. But the most significant change wasn't in his circumstances. It was in his attitude. 3 months into his court-ordered counseling, Frank had finally admitted he had a serious gambling addiction. The counselor, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, had helped him understand that his problem went far beyond losing money. Gambling had become his way of avoiding responsibility, of escaping from the reality of raising a son alone and dealing with grief over my mother's death. Dr. Martinez had been frank with both of us during a joint session she'd arranged. Addiction doesn't excuse theft, she'd told Frank directly, but understanding your addiction helps explain how you convinced yourself that stealing from your son was acceptable. You weren't just gambling with money. You were gambling with relationships, trust, and family bonds. Frank had written me a letter 2 weeks after that session. It was the first real communication we'd had since the dinner at the church, and reading it had been one of the hardest things I'd ever done. He didn't make excuses or try to justify his actions. Instead, he took complete responsibility for his betrayal and acknowledged the depth of hurt he'd caused. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, he'd written in his careful handwriting. I stole from your mother's memory, lied to our community, and destroyed the most important relationship in my life for money I threw away on poker tables and football games. I can't undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I understand exactly how wrong I was. Your mother would be ashamed of the man I became, and I have to live with that knowledge every day. The letter had moved me more than I'd expected. For the first time since our phone call in Afghanistan, Frank sounded like the father I'd once respected instead of the desperate stranger he'd become. But I wasn't ready to rebuild our relationship, And I'd told him so, in my carefully measured response. I'd used my inheritance exactly as I'd promised. The Sarah Sullivan Memorial Fund at Mercy General Hospital had provided assistance to 12 families dealing with cancer treatment costs. The fund also sponsored an annual scholarship for nursing students, ensuring that my mother's dedication to healthcare would continue helping others long after her death. I'd returned to complete my deployment with a clear conscience and a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The remaining money from the inheritance had allowed me to finish my engineering degree without debt, and I'd graduated summa cum laude with a degree in civil engineering. My first job was with a firm that specialized in infrastructure projects for rural communities, work that felt like a natural extension of my military service. But the real resolution came on the anniversary of my mother's death, when I visited her grave for the first time since confronting Frank. I brought flowers and a copy of my engineering degree, laying both on her headstone while I told her about everything that had happened. "I kept your sacrifice safe, Mom," I whispered to the granite stone. "Frank couldn't destroy what you built for me. Your money went exactly where you intended it to go, and it's helping other people too." As I knelt there in the quiet cemetery, I heard footsteps approaching. Frank stood about 20 feet away, holding his own small bouquet of flowers. He looked uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to be there. "I didn't know you were here," he said quietly. "I can come back another time." I studied his face, seeing genuine humility there for the first time in years. "You can stay," I said finally. "She was your wife before she was my mother." Frank approached slowly and placed his flowers next to mine. We stood there in silence for several minutes, both lost in our own thoughts and memories of the woman who'd brought us together and whose memory had driven us apart. "I went to my first Gamblers Anonymous meeting yesterday," Frank said eventually. "Dr. Martinez says I should have gone years ago, but I was too proud to admit I needed help." "How was it?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Humbling," Frank replied. "Hearing other people's stories made me realize how many people I hurt with my choices. Not just you, but Jim, the church community, everyone who believed my lies." We talked for another few minutes, the first real conversation we'd had since everything fell apart. Frank didn't ask for forgiveness or try to rebuild our relationship. Instead, he focused on taking responsibility and making amends where possible. He'd already started paying back Tony Romano in small installments and had written apology letters to everyone he'd lied to. As I prepared to leave, Frank looked at me with something that might have been hope. "Do you think," he asked carefully, "that someday we might be able to have coffee together? Not as father and son, maybe, but as two people who both loved your mother?" I considered his question seriously before answering. "Maybe," I said, "when you've been clean for a full year and can prove you're serious about changing, but it won't be the relationship we had before. That trust is gone forever." Frank nodded, understanding that this was the best offer he was going to get. "I'll earn whatever relationship you're willing to give me," he said, "even if that's just being able to visit your mother's grave at the same time without making you uncomfortable." 6 months later, Frank completed his first year of sobriety and anger management counseling. We began meeting monthly for coffee at a diner across town from where we'd both grown up. Our conversations were careful and limited, focusing on his recovery progress and my work projects. We weren't father and son anymore, but we weren't enemies either. Frank had found work as a maintenance supervisor at the hospital where my mother had worked, a job that Dr. Martinez had suggested as part of his amends process. Being surrounded by healthcare workers who remembered my mother helped him stay connected to the magnitude of what he'd stolen and lost. The last time we met, Frank showed me a letter he'd written to the Sarah Sullivan Memorial Fund, donating his first full month's salary to honor my mother's memory. "It's not much," he said, "but it's clean money earned through honest work. I want to contribute to what she built, instead of destroying it." Looking at my father across that diner table, I saw a man who'd lost everything and was slowly building a new life based on honesty and accountability. He would never be the father I'd once respected, but he was becoming a man my mother might not have been ashamed to know. The real lesson I learned wasn't about revenge or justice, but about the power of consequences to change people. Frank had to lose everything he cared about before he could become someone worth caring about again. My mother's sacrifice had been protected, her memory had been honored, and the man who'd betrayed both had been forced to confront who he really was. Some betrayals can be forgiven over time, but they can never be forgotten. Frank and I had found a way to coexist peacefully, but the trust between us was gone forever. That was the price he paid for gambling with something that should have been sacred. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? And do you think there's always a path back to forgiveness after such deep betrayal? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe for more real-life stories about justice and redemption, and share this with anyone who's ever had to stand up for what's right when family lets them down. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that sometimes the most important battles we fight are the ones that protect the memory and sacrifice of those we love. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.